Spotlights, the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and this week I'm really happy to welcome onto the show O'Neill Van Horn. O'Neill, thanks for making time for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it and looking forward to the conversation ahead.
Yeah, we got lots to chat about. And for people who don't know you, you're an assistant professor in the theology department at Xavier University, which is a Jesuit university in Cincinnati, Ohio. And you have a book coming out that I had the great pleasure of reading and reviewing, and it's called On the Ground, Terrestrial Theopoetics and Planetary Politics. So exciting stuff. So we want to talk about that and some other things that you have going on. Um, but first, one of the things I always chat with people about on this podcast is why doing work where theology and planetary or ecological issues converge. Because, of course, a lot of people think those are very disparate things. And if you want to engage with like planetary politics, get into policy or activism or science. But theology, that has nothing to do with it. And then likewise, if you're doing theology, then focus on otherworldly things, talk about God and heaven and things like that. So what's your path?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I was reflecting with my students just yesterday that a lot of the eco-theologians and climate scientists and climate activists that I know have a certain origin story that often looks similar, and that's often the loss of a place.
Mm.
This sort of thread was identified by one of my teachers, Laurel Kearns, who you know and the listeners and viewers may know. And she noted this, that we all have these realizations that, oh, I had this tree in my grandma's front yard that I used to climb, and then it got cut down by the city, or I used to play in these trails, and this or that happened. And that for me is sort of the origin, but that realization came much later, that I was always spending time outdoors, and being from Southern California, I have much more recently realized the gravity of the loss that had been going on and that continues to go on. But I would say the narrative that I often tell starts with food, which might sound a little bit shallow, but hopefully I can explain. During college, I was studying biblical studies in Spanish, trying to wrestle with big questions that I had, and was just so excited to be able to be in classes that allowed me to engage those questions. And part of that took me to Central America, where I was studying and then living and kind of backpacking around. And that time, in effect, radicalized me in a variety of ways, I think. But upon return to the States, after living among agricultural, agrarian communities and folks with a different sense of an experience with regard to poverty and impoverishment and its relation to international development and all that, I came back with sort of new eyes to see our society here in the States, and specifically the thing that caught my attention was food waste. And it was just such a gross injustice to me after spending time there and coming back and realizing, oh my gosh, this place, this culture was not what I thought it was. And so that for me led to, and this isn't something I talk about publicly very often, but I'm happy to share here, a sort of vow that I took with a couple of friends to not spend money on food for as long as we could, and to spend our time dumpster diving and procuring food out of trash cans and things of that nature, which I want to name, comes with a lot of privilege, I guess, that one can do that sort of work late at night, acquiring food from dumpsters and things like that, and not be at risk of having adverse sort of contact with the authorities, if you will, et cetera. So I started thinking a lot about food and food waste. And then I realized that I needed to think about food from the front end, from the perspective of growing food. And for me, that question emerged because I was at that time studying biblical studies in college. I thought I wanted to go on and be like a historical critic and do that sort of classical work. And I realized that I would never be a good and would never be a responsible reader of the Bible unless I developed some sort of agrarian worldview, or at least had some sort of agrarian experience. And so what that meant for me was that when I was heading off to grad school, I decided I wouldn't go to grad school unless I was also farming. And so I took on the work of a farmer for a couple seasons full time as I was studying theology, trying to immerse myself in a world that was more similar to the world of the text than this sort of perpetually 75-degree life that Southern California has to offer. And so that process, I kind of began to find my way through those questions through food, but that eventually broadened um, to realizing the intersections between food and race and class and geography and whatnot. And I could elaborate on the specificities that took, or the academic questions that led to, I guess. But that's sort of my origin story, I guess. To connect it more explicitly to theology, and then we can turn to wherever we head to in this conversation. um I feel like there's something really deeply important about sharing meals together around a table, something about that. I mean, whether you call it communion or fellowship or whatever language you give to that, there's something um beyond just the food that happens at a table. And so for me, that always kind of felt like a spiritual experience, that feeling of generosity and hospitality, often characteristics that people might ascribe to the divine or something like that. Um, and so I guess the way that I frame, though, this connection between religion slash theology and the environment for my students is an activity that I did just yesterday in one of my classes called 9 Whys. And I just want to recommend that folks look into this activity, but specifically the sort of teaching structure that it comes from. It's called Liberating Structures. And it was recommended to me by a dear friend, Nikia. And I just want to give a shout out to them, Nikia in Detroit. This activity 9 Whys involves you asking a question, and then when someone gives a response, asking why, and doing that 9 times over, kind of like a little kid would do. And it's really
Right.
obnoxious. But so the question that I asked my students yesterday is, why should we do anything about global climate change? Why should we try and stop it or mitigate it or slow it down? And when you do this activity, you initially get responses like, well, the ecosystem is like, we're embedded in ecosystems and we need these things to thrive. And you kind of get this sort of surface level, often beginning of like, well, these things are a means to our survival. But then you get to the question of, well, why is survival important? And why is life important? And is it just human life? And when you ask why 9 times and students sit there frustrated, but really pondering these questions, we begin to see that global climate change is a theological problem. It poses those big human questions that theology, I think, has been wrestling with about existence and vocation and purpose and community and whatnot. And so that's how in the classroom that finds expression in my work. I'm happy to say more about any of that, but also looking forward to just getting into some of the stuff that I'm up to today, or I don't know,
Yeah.
whatever would be most interesting to you.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, so much there. I mean, yeah, dumpster diving and farming, and I like that point. That's like, well, any of those things can just seem like, well, it's just about food, or it's just about survival. But then when you push those questions of, well, why though? Yeah, I like that a lot. 9 Whys. I'm definitely gonna use that. That's a lot of whys, really. A few whys will get you pretty far, but nine, you're definitely
Yeah.
gonna hit theological questions at that point.
And when your professor's standing at the front of the class counting the responses, and you realize you're only at 5 and you have 4 more, and it's really fascinating by the end. There's a lot of frustration, but often it's like someone just exasperatedly says like, because we're all beloved children of God and we all deserve it. And they say something exclamatory like that. And it's really fascinating and really beautiful, and also needs some nuancing often, but they begin to see the gravity of things like climate change beyond just 440 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, or pick your data point that you might want to accentuate, 2.5 degrees Celsius, or so on and so forth.
Yeah. And I really like how this all started for you with food, because to me, there's something about like food and water where it's like, well, this is the part of the environment that we have to put in our body all the time. And so what it's such a great starting point, because once you start connecting the dots, like, oh, well, where's the food come from? You start thinking about farms, and we start thinking about farms, you start thinking about soil and the planet, and it starts just expanding. And so it's a great starting point. And of course, a great starting point for Christianity, for which food is central, because there's that cracker that people eat on Sundays. And so, very significant. So much of, what the gospel is about is just Jesus eating with people.
Hmm.
A huge part of the story.
Yeah.
Um,
And a tool that I learned again from Laurel Kearns, I didn't expect to be giving her so many shout outs, but when you reference the Eucharist, I can't resist. One thing that she often does in her classes that I've adopted as part of my own practice is to ask students about that bread and about that wine, which is to say, ask them questions like, if this bread comes from wheat that was grown by uh, undocumented migrants who are paid an unlivable wage or paid slave wages effectively, is that still a holy thing? Can it still
mhm,
be sacred?
mhm,
Or if that wheat was sprayed with Roundup by, whatever mega multinational agribusiness corporation, is it still holy? Or if that wine comes from Northern California and is using massive amounts of water in ways that California can't afford to do, is that still indeed the body and blood of Christ? Um, and those are the sorts of questions that I think help folks, both practitioners and laypersons alike, find their way into these sorts of connections between things that folks like you and I and others that talk about this a lot take for granted, maybe, or just assume are, of course, theology and ecology are one and the same, or vastly entangled. But some of these questions and tools and activities I've found to be really, really fruitful.
that's good. I like that. Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning Laurel Kearns. We've chatted a bit about getting her on the podcast and just keep missing each other. So it's like every few months we'll send an email like that, maybe now. And it's like, oh, hold on. And
Yeah.
so maybe soon. And but yeah, obviously doing great work. And Drew University has definitely become a hub for this kind of
Hmm.
thinking.
Hmm.
And it's one of those things that it's important to be able to really get into the weeds about it, but also to learn how to talk about it to people who don't know it yet. And like you're saying, like, well, once you do this work for a long time, it's easy to just kind of take for granted that these things are so connected. But how do you tell people that don't know they're connected and get them to see those connections? And so that's a good thought. Yeah,
Hmm.
so I'll definitely be using that discussion of the Eucharist. So taking good notes here for teaching. This is
Yeah,
all very
absolutely.
helpful.
And I hope that this is in some way generative or meaningful to the listeners and viewers. I think a lot about my work. I'm focused a lot on teaching, partly because of my institutional context and what it emphasizes, but partly because that's why I got into this work, because of the professors that I had in my life, which is a really odd juxtaposition to a rather dense and rather academically focused book that is about to come out under my name. But a lot of my attention is focused on teaching and pedagogy, and so hopefully that's of use to those that spend their time listening to this.
Yeah. A good point. I see my own work that way. Like when I write books and things, it's like, well, that's important work and it can be really generative, but I ultimately hope that it's supportive of teaching. Because
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, like that's the work we have to do. Otherwise, there's just a handful of people who care about these things, and like, well, we need something much bigger
Mm-hmm.
because we have a serious global environmental crisis on our hands, and so that
Mm-hmm.
kind of outreach is just crucial.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
no doubt.
and yet that does mean we need careful thinking, and we do need academic rigor as part of it. It's one of those things like the best thing you can do right now is think,
Mm.
and we need careful thinking about it. Otherwise, it's so easy just to repeat the mindset that got us into this mess. And so, with that, I want to chat definitely about this book, On the Ground: Terrestrial Theopoetics and Planetary Politics, coming out with Fordham, I guess in like a few weeks at this point.
I
And
think
so,
December 5th.
yeah, and so this will be, when is this podcast episode coming out? I think maybe the first week of November. So yeah, so when people are listening to this, it'll be out soon, and really a lot of great stuff in there that I think is eminently valuable for teaching and for spreading the word about the importance of doing theology to help think through the environmental crisis.
Mm.
And first off, I'd like to hear you say a little bit about ground, because I know you distinguish ground from foundation. And so many people, when they think about theology, a crucial thing is you need like a transcendent foundation to secure all meaning and value in the world. And then without that foundation, it's just nihilism, and nobody can have any secure belief. And then turns out foundations are actually a bit of a problem, and then something called ground might actually find a middle way between having a foundation and having just nothingness.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it's one of the central ones of my book. Initially, the question sort of stemmed from my deep love and hatred of Paul Tillich and his notion of ground of being. Hatred in the sense of just frustration with the beauty and rigor and difficulty of reading his work. Um, but I think the idea of ground is absolutely critical for a number of reasons. We could talk theologically in the ways that you've named, but I think just very practically in this moment of, I don't know, whatever moment or whatever name we give to this moment, like the postmodern or post-truth or something like that, of just rampant political division and religious illiteracy and so on, mostly funded by disinformation campaigns from the top. I don't want to blame folks for what they've inherited per se.
Mhm.
Um, but the idea of ground, like something to stake claims on or make claims on or to draw connections between, I think is absolutely crucial in this moment in which facts are up for debate and truth is whatever you believe it to be or something like that. And I think ground helps us think about our relations in ways that attend to critical difference by neither flattening them nor essentializing them. I spent a lot of time teaching in prisons for Rutgers University, teaching moral philosophy. And in that context, I was confronted with my own social location and its sort of vast differences from my students who were incarcerated, mostly of color, mostly older than me, frankly, and so on. And so we had to establish this relationship, this sort of grounding for us to begin to do our work. And I think that it's absolutely necessary that we recognize the particularities of our own location, social, ecological, and so forth, but also not essentialize them or yeah, sort of solidify them in a way that might be kind of harmful, uh, that might come out in a variety of ways. And so this sort of inclination that I had, that I think this is an important idea, and it was important for me personally too to figure out what does it mean to do anti-racist work in solidarity with folks of color who are doing this work. What is my place in this, et cetera. It was important for me personally in that way, but also sort of it with the, I guess frankly the like nerdier side of me. It was a frustration with folks like Deleuze and Derrida that seemed to
Mm.
be kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that ground and foundation were synonymous. And so we've got to do away with these things because they create hierarchies of a sort. And anything that resembles this sort of plane is, yeah, a sort of transcendent, signified, or something to that effect. And we can get into that stuff if you find that interesting. But that's sort of where it came from and why I think it's important. And happy to clarify more about how I'm defining it. I guess I'll just say preliminarily, because I would imagine that this was where we might go. Another frustration that I had too is that in this sort of trajectory of ground of being, sort of thought from Tillich and Heidegger and so forth, I was annoyed that like no one was thinking about soil,
Right.
like what ground is there but the earth ground, and that's sort of the grounding thesis of the book. What if we were to think ground as soil? What does soil have to offer us as a conceptual metaphor or a material symbol for relating across critical difference? And that includes interpersonal human relations, but also how we think about bioregions and how those relate to one another and where they begin and end and so forth.
Yeah.
So I'll pause there, but yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. and and yeah, so much to say about people like Deleuze and Derrida, because that does seem to be the thing, that there was such a critical edge to that project that then people come away thinking that they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and it becomes so groundless, and it's so, it's just abysses everywhere. And then there's probably ways to read them where you find like, no, there's still the baby there a little bit, they didn't throw it out, but it's kind of like, well, you guys have lent yourself to these readings. It's very
Yeah.
hard to not read them that way. And I mean, gee, I think maybe Derrida, especially because of all the rhetorical flourishes and everything, it's like, what are you trying to say? and and so it really does, it becomes so groundless that you really kind of lose any connection to reality. I especially appreciate your point. And this is one of the things I found really refreshing when I was reading the book, is that when you're talking about the ground, you're talking about the actual ground, you're talking about soil, as well as things like, Grund in German philosophy and things like that, where it's the reason for things, the rational ground of things, the ground of being. And I find that so frustrating when people, and I get this through a lot of environmental philosophy, where people will say stuff like, I'm going to do a philosophy of plants, and then it's all these metaphors, and they never talk about an actual plant. And so, likewise, people talk about the ground all the time, and they never talk about soil or bioregions or actual ground.
Hmm.
And so, I know when I was first reading your manuscript, and it's like on the ground, I was like, all right, we'll see where this goes. And then you started to talk about actual ground, and I was like, well, what a delight.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I appreciate that. I think it's so important for people to come back to their actual body, their actual place.
Hmm.
Otherwise, and the metaphors are great too, and the various kind of valences of meaning around these things, but I feel like something so important is lost if we forget to connect it to our actual bodies and our actual places.
Hmm.
So I really appreciate that, and that you do it in such a poetic way. um, I wonder, along those lines, you're doing something called theopoetics, and I think that's still kind of underrepresented in people's ideas of what theology and religious studies is about. And it's not just, an incidental kind of like, well, you could say theology, you could say theopoetics. It's a very distinctive approach to things. So, what do
Hmm.
you mean when you're talking about theopoetics?
Oh, that's a good question. And as I'm thinking about it, I want to come back to the Deleuze and Derrida thing, uh, because I feel like some Deleuzians and Derridians might come for me. So I want to clarify a couple of things. But in any case, the way that I think about theopoetics is not strictly a stylistic flourish or embellishment. I think of poetics as trying to push language to where language can't go or hasn't yet gone, to sort of envision or envisage that which isn't fully nameable or articulable. And this is why, for me, in a bit in this project, but in some of my other writing too, especially more recently, I think of theopoetics as really related to negative theology or mysticism or apophatic theology, or however you kind of prefer to think about that sort of world, and schools of thought and life ways. Um, the connection being that uh, the a certain inarticulableness, if you will, of divinity. If um, we're really in some meaningful, authentic kind of way describing that which is sacred or holy or divine, surely it's not capturable in language.
Yep.
And what a um, I don't know, braggadocious kind of thing to assume that we can grasp these things, and what violence we do when we grasp these things. The way that I explain it to my students is, as soon as we think that we have the truth, we've lost it.
Yeah.
And in that process of trying to found our thinking on certainty as opposed to uncertainty, we often um, turn the things that we're discussing into objects, typically objects for our own gain or manipulation, or often tools for violence. And so we turn the divine into an idol to represent our own political stance or what have you. And it's a really difficult thing to get away from, especially in a world that demands a lot of confidence in the face of injustice, that we need certain confidence to say things like Black Lives Matter, or to say like there's a genocide happening in Gaza right now. Um, but there's also, I think, room and space and need for um, unsaying things when we get to those edges of language about that which isn't fully nameable or sayable or sensible, yet still trying to make sense of them, to play with words a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, very well said. Yeah, I really appreciate that because it's a very kind of paradoxical thing. It's like, well, if you need a deep confidence in our ethical and political commitments, then you're going to need a very certain claims about things. Like, no, actually, the certainty is going to get in the way, and you
Mm-hmm.
need a sort of vulnerability to maintain some kind of openness to your situation. And
Mm-hmm.
certainty is going to foreclose that openness. So, how do we speak in a way that maintains that kind of vulnerability, that openness to our situation? And so, yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's a very helpful way to describe theopoetics. I know there's lots of ways to define it, and I
Sure.
thought that was very helpful.
Mm.
And of course, one of the ways that people are drawing on these kind of apophatic theological traditions these days is that they are very influenced by people like Deleuze and Derrida. They've been very generative for thinking outside the box when it comes to maintaining a sense of uncertainty or indeterminacy or
Mm-hmm.
openness or the chaotic dimensions of order and organization.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, let's circle back to those because we don't want the Deleuzians and Derridians coming for you.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's a perfect sort of segue, that openness is what I love about Deleuze and Derrida, and why I think soil is a really fascinating and sort of all too perfect symbol and material that illustrates that openness, that um, ever perpetual unfolding. Soil is never static and it doesn't ever arrive at a telos, but it's only ever cycling. In the same way that we see that sort of cycling in play through sign to sign in Derridian theory, if you will. But I want to just say really that I try and say in the book that I'm trying to give a sort of Derridian reading of ground, or offer a Derridian sort of translation of ground, in a sense that ground is not the foundation that he's worried about. And I'm also worried about that same foundation. And I try and make space for giving Derrida the benefit of the doubt. For example, naming that like fond in French is both ground and foundation. And so it may be on translators more so than on Derrida himself. And similarly, I think Deleuze does a lot of grounding work through things like the plane of immanence and whatnot, that I find deeply helpful and finds its way throughout the book as well. But there are certain things that rub me the wrong way. When you're talking about metaphors related to plants or soil or what have you, right? They have their place and they're really important. But one of the questions that I think about often is, what are the consequences of those metaphors? Um, and one of the things that I am often harping on is Deleuze's arborescent structure versus rhizomatic sort of pluralism, or assemblages, or whatever language you want to give to it. Um, that I understand the point about arborescent structures and the taproot and the hierarchical valuation systems that emerge from that. And also, in a moment of planetary crisis, I think we need all the metaphors that we can get to help us in this work for environmental justice. And I'm no longer interested in demonizing the arborescent, because of our great need for trees and for plants that have taproots, and many of them we eat and are nourished by. That's just a little quibble, but that's one of the ways that I think our language unintentionally reifies or reinforces certain injustices in the world. And this comes out in one of the chapters in the book, and also another chapter or another article I've written on what I call dark hope, trying to reclaim darkness as richness and vibrancy, as opposed to a sort of negative thing, which can have all kinds of consequences when we think about race and racialization and color and colorism and so forth.
All right. Well said. I think you got away with it. I don't think the Delusians and Deridians will be too mad at you.
They'll
Um,
have something to say, and I have something to learn from them too.
that's true. They always have something to say. I identify with those
Oh
folks to some
goodness.
extent. But it's just it's a different time and place. And, the demands of 21st century thought are a little different than what they were dealing with
No
in
doubt.
the latter half of the 20th century. So I think we can honor them a lot and still have a lot to learn from them. But we have different issues to deal with, and so there's just a slightly different way of speaking that's called for now.
Hmm.
And there's reparative readings of those guys along those lines. There's little hints where they're like, well, there's roots and rhizomes. There's rhizomes and roots. We don't want to make it too much of a dualism there.
Yeah, yeah,
And then they go on to say, anyway, we hate trees. And so like, it's complicated to say the least. Um, so yeah, I want to definitely hear more about Dark Hope. And that's there's this book that came out recently, Earthly Things: Immanence, New Materialisms, and Planetary Thinking. And you have a chapter in there. Oh, wonderful, perfect.
I have it
Uh,
handy.
on the matter of hope, weaving threads of Jewish wisdom for the sake of the planetary, and that really intersects a lot with your discussion of Dark Hope in On the Ground. And now, I mean, even you mentioned the genocide in Gaza and global climate change. It's this devastating things happening around the planet. It's a difficult time to talk about hope. And when you say dark hope, it sounds like it's going to be a pessimistic hope, but that's
Hmm.
not where you're going with dark hope. So yeah, what's it mean to speak of hope in a time like this?
Yeah, such a difficult thing. And I think it might be pessimistic in a way, but not in the sort of broad cultural sense of pessimism that often might like lead to apathy, but more of a pessimism of a critical sort that we see in Afro-pessimism or in the work of Miguel de la Torre more recently. Um, but and I think increasingly I identify as a hopeful pessimist, um, inspired by De La Torre and others. The way that I think about hope, the way that I teach about hope, um, is that it's not something that we have; it's something that we make. And this is not something that I've come up with. I mean, Willie Jennings has said in a Yale interview of some sort that hope is a discipline, and
Mm.
Roberto Che Espinoza describes hope in this sort of discipline, active kind of way. Um, and if that's the case, if hope is something that we make as opposed to have, it makes talking about hope a little bit easier, because I don't feel hopeful really ever. Or
Yeah.
in spare moments, often with my students when they do something that is lovely or brilliant or thoughtful or caring. Um, and so I think it takes some of the burden off that like I have to feel hopeful about what's going to happen. Um, and instead, I can recognize that the grounds of hope is not certainty but uncertainty, that I don't have to be certain that it's going to get better, and if I am, that often leads to greater apathy because I am absolved of my responsibility to whatever problem it is that I've created or inherited or am now accountable to. And so I describe hope as a dark hope because I think hope dwells in that and is predicated on that uncertainty, that it's uncertainty in the first place that hope needs to exist, um, at all. Um, and so dark hope, the darkness of dark hope in the book is trying to point to the symbol of soil darkness, pointing to richness and vibrancy and um, organic fecundity and whatnot, but also a reclamation of dark as in its positive connotations, given what folks like Catherine Keller call light supremacy, which I think is a really funny quip, but also like a really important thing to recognize in our speech. So I think of hope then as something that we make, something that we weave, which is what comes out in the chapter in Earthly Things. They're specifically drawing on the notion of the Hebrew word tikva, which appears in some biblical texts in the Tanakh. Tikva meaning both hope as well as like chord or string. And so playing with that sort of dual nature of this word tikva um, was helpful in thinking about what it means to make hope, especially in the face of crisis or in the wake of disaster. And so in that chapter specifically, I'm thinking about what it looked like to make hope after the destruction of the Second Temple and the advent of Rabbinic Judaism, but also what did it look like? Was it possible? Is it possible to make hope in the wake of a disaster like the Shoah? Um, and it's a very tricky topic to discuss right now. Um, it's so important to recognize the gravity of it, but it has also been mobilized to justify other atrocities as well that we've already named. And so I maybe want to leave that portion of the argument to stand on its own in the chapter, and would love to engage with folks if they have comments or want to reach out or slam me for this or that. That's fine. But there's a certain, I think, mystical nature to hope then, that it is experimental, it's improvisational, it's pushing us in new directions, kind of in a tentacular kind of way, but also I think demands a certain apophasis or an unsaying of itself to return to the problem that provoked the need for hope in the first place, to reassess and ensure that are my responses to that problem in fact engendering or realizing the change that I hoped to see. And I think the gravity, the scale, and the complexity of something like global climate change demands a hope that is improvisational, but also folds back and reassesses and reattunes as complex things like tipping points and amplifiers and keystone species create non-linear sorts of dynamics in the changes that are happening. I don't feel like any of that was particularly clear about hope, but I also am pretty confident that hope is not a clear thing. I guess the last thing I'll say about hope and is really a loose quote from Miguel de la Torre in a lecture that he gave that eventually became his book on hopelessness. And it's the thing that I say to students, and it's the thing that I sort of think about late at night, almost every night, as I'm despairing about whatever it is that I'm despairing about. In this lecture, De La Torre asks, do you do justice because you're going to win or because it's right? And he says, I seek justice, I do justice because it defines my humanity, not because I'm going to win. And that's kind of how I've begun to think about hope, that it doesn't have to be successful per se. And if that's the case, then that, for me, as someone who experiences climate grief, much like probably other folks that are listening to this and beyond it, it actually feels so catalyzing to know that I don't have to succeed or win, but my work is faithful all the same. And I think that's the beauty of and also difficulty of hope, is that it doesn't guarantee that victory will come, and it doesn't guarantee that one will survive through the night, and it doesn't guarantee anything. It is really only articulable, I think, through the sort of rhetoric of faith or religiosity or spirituality, or however you think of it, because it draws us outside of ourselves, in spite of ourselves, often, in the face of the impossible. So I was hoping to end on a clearer note, but I think we're just going to end in ambiguity on that one.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of in one of Paul's epistles, he talks about hope against hope.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, well, yeah, that is ambiguous, and that is, yeah, that's the nature of hope, or certainly the hope that is called for now. Also reminds me of Martin Luther King somewhere in one of his speeches refers to the situation where, like, if you knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the world was going to end tomorrow, and you had like a sapling of an apple tree in your hand, what would you do? And he's like, you plant it, you plant the tree, and you know it's not going to bear fruit. The world's ending tomorrow, but you
Mm-hmm.
don't do it because of the outcome. You do it because it's the right thing to do. We're human
Mm-hmm.
beings. We're here to cultivate and nurture life. So that's what I'm going to do, even if the world is ending tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something he got actually from the Quran, where it's a palm frond instead of an apple tree.
Mm-hmm.
So nice switch, very American apple tree. It's
Yeah.
like I know my audience.
Yeah.
But
Well,
yeah, I appreciate that. It's a difficult stance to hold, and crucial to speak up for, because I think, without that, then despair, you just are wallowing in despair, and they're like, what's that going to do? So yeah, important to think about.
yeah. And I
And
think the allusion to Dr. King is really helpful because in the book, there's these little interludes, these little sort of narrative vignettes or poetic kind of materializations of what happened in the body chapters. And after the chapter on hope, there's this little interlude about seeds and seed saving and seed sowing. And the allusion to Dr. King, I think, is apt because I try to in that space and want to reflect now that I think of hope as sowing, SOW, sowing,
right,
so sowing of seeds. It's not a guaranteed act, but it's a prayerful act. We can cultivate contexts in which growth is possible, but we can't guarantee it. There's this great little sort of parable of sorts in the monks in Confucian text. I was going to quote the sort of the location of the text exactly, and I'm going to fail, so I won't do it. But it's about a man from Song who is really worried about the state of his grain that he's planted, and he's so worried that he runs out to his field and tries to help the plants grow, and he sort of gently tugs on them to help them grow, and then he comes out to his field the next morning and has realized that his crops have withered because he's obviously tried to force growth. Um, and that particular text is about righteousness, and you can aim at righteousness, but can't seize it or apprehend it in a
right,
direct way. And I think hope is kind of similar to that, that it's prayerful, disciplined work of apprenticing oneself to the cultivation of context, but it can do no more than that. And if anyone who's like a teacher of or an educator of any kind, um, you know that teaching is only ever planting seeds and hoping that they grow, but trying to force growth or force caring about a class or force an assignment to happen or force a lecture never works. And so maybe that's just how I help myself sleep at night, is that I think that my only work is planting seeds, but I really do think that that's all that we can do, and yet it's the most faithful thing that we can do. I didn't expect
right.
this to be so Christian sounding and so many biblical allusions and things like that. But here we are.
Well, you threw in some Confucianism. That's
Yeah,
good.
okay. Well, that's right.
Well, and you also describe the act of sowing as subversive. So I wonder if you could say what's subversive about sowing seeds.
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thanks. I think of sewing as subversive because um it goes against all of the ideologies or ways of thought that underlie things like finance capitalism or geoengineering or these sort of mechanistic ideas of that's painting broad brushstrokes, especially about geoengineering. I don't feel any need to give the benefit of the doubt to finance capitalism, but
Right.
um, it's subversive in that there is no programmatic calculation that can happen. Yes, you can calculate how many seeds you need to sow for however many row feet in order to get the crop yield that you desire. But if you're doing that in an organic, biodynamic, or regenerative or no-till kind of way, that's not guaranteed.
Right.
And to predicate one's work on that idea of linearity or uniformity or mechanistic change is, I think, a farce and a fallacy. And this is something that I've learned both from farming in practice, but also from folks like William Connolly in thinking about dynamism and bumpy timescapes and all of his work on the nonlinear rate of change. The global climate change is a changing rate of change and not just linear change. And so I think things like sowing offer us a symbol of what it means to attend to the complexity, attend to the multiplicity of that exists in a single place, in a single bioregion and whatnot. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's good. And again, it's you spell it out very clearly in the book as well.
Hopefully it's
And
clearer there than here.
well, it's just different. It's a different kind of clarity because less conversational, and it's more it's very like rigorously argued and articulated, and so it's a different kind of thing. And that's one of the reasons I like having people on the podcast is to be like, hey, well, let's just talk like normal people and not necessarily like book talk. It's a different kind of space. Well, one more thing I definitely want to chat about is what you mean by planetary politics, right? It's in the subtitle, because I don't know, people really don't like politics lately and are just mad at it in general, and it's very polarizing in this country and abroad. And you have a vision that's not just about partisan politics, and so something about politics at this planetary scale. It opens it up in a new dimension, one that it would be hopeful in a dark way, of course, but it was part of the book that I found really invigorating was the way you engaged theopoetics and thinking of
Mm,
the ground to a political dimension, which is just so crucial right now.
yeah. Thanks. Yeah. You are right to say that I don't mean partisan politics. I don't, by politics, I don't mean the structures of governance in like a Foucauldian sort of way. Um, but thinking about the political as that which matters in a material way to our lives and livelihoods and the life of the planet and its many inhabitants. So the way that I describe planetary politics in the book is drawing on this idea of ground in order to make a case for contextual bioregional collectives that commune across critical difference, but are willing to draw exclusions, not border walls per se, and not exclusivity against particular peoples or things like that, but rather to note the edges of their bioregion or the capacities of their care and concern or what have you. We're always excluding something in our decision-making processes. And so to foreground those exclusions is absolutely critical, naming that I'm making this decision because of these priorities, and I'm choosing these worlds over these worlds. And this is something that I get from both William Connolly as well as Eva Haifa Giraud. I don't know how to pronounce their last name, but Giraud for any folks interested. They wrote a book called After Entanglement that was absolutely critical to my thought. And so I guess the thing that I am trying to do with planetary politics is, trying to think bioregionally, because I'm rather convinced that, and this will sound hyperbolic or exaggerative or something, and I guess I mean it that way. Like, we won't save the planet, and I don't mean that something better won't come or we won't be able to meaningfully resist this. That's what I'm dedicated to, and I think you are and many others. When I say we won't save the planet, I mean that there is no panacea, there is no cure-all to this planetary crisis. This is something that folks like Wendell Berry and so many others have said, that if this is to be resisted, it will only ever be through saving limitless locales and a multiplicity of places, of particular places, and those particular places need particular things and have particular priorities. And so fecundity or fertility in one region is not the same as another, in the same way that we humans culturally don't hold the same values sort of across cultures, whether warm climate and cold climate, or name the difference that you want to accentuate. And so by attending to contextuality, I think we can but a contextuality that doesn't silo itself, a contextuality that isn't essentialized in any particular way, but is amorphous and intersects with other locales and other communities and cultures and whatnot, is an interesting way to think about the work of politics. And so in that chapter, I use soil organic matter, particular elements of soil, to illustrate the processes of cycling and processual sort of interfacing and becoming that I think this sort of work requires. I said at the beginning of this interview or sometime in it that this book I feel like is rather niche and dense, and I think this is coming out in how I'm trying to explain this, but hopefully it illuminates something in what I'm arguing there that might be useful to the listeners here.
Yeah, I think so. And I appreciate mentioning Wendell Berry because folks like him really trying to revitalize like agrarian lifestyles, and I feel like bioregionalism isn't mentioned that much, and people kind of forgot about it to some extent. And I still think that that's an extremely important part of any vision of a viable future is
Mm-hmm.
to restore our bioregions and to think at that scale. To think about local places and how to regenerate them. And I know that's one of the things that really gives me hope is some friends of mine who are farmers and who are doing like regenerative agriculture, and you're like, okay, you guys are going to be fine. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of other people are not, but there will be places and hubs that are able to regenerate their landscape. And if we can connect those places with one another, then something really amazing could grow in the ruins of the collapsing industrial civilization that we're part of right now.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think it's one of the pitfalls of something like agrarianism or bioregionalism is sort of the romanticization of rural life
yeah,
and a failure to recognize the violences that have created the uniformity and homogeneity of those communities, land theft and redlining and the GI Bill and so on and so forth. Um, but I think that there are deep resonances still all the same, and this is why I'm holding on to this idea and wanting to make these connections. There's deep connections and resonances between bioregionalism and, say, intersectional environmental justice,
yeah,
right? That each are naming the the critical nature of particularity, not to an exclusionary way and or an exclusionary extent, and not to essentialize or objectify those aspects of a place or those identity markers of a person, but to note the yeah the particularities that come with location, whether
yeah,
social or ecological. And so I think these tasks of environmental justice, especially environmental justice that's attentive to um, white supremacist forms of environmental racism and whatnot, and bioregionalism that's deeply attentive to the particularities of place. These things don't feel disparate at all to me, so long as we are attentive to or refrain from the romanticization of
yeah.
just farming and its beauty and joy, and it's not. Anyone who's farmed knows that it's difficult and terrible and lovely all the same, but just absolutely backbreaking.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, and I think, speaking of how, your book is very dense and niche and stuff, but what you're articulating is something that really hasn't been said before, which is this kind of like intersectional bioregionalism or bioregional intersectionality. And you're bringing
Oh,
those
that's
worlds
good.
together, I think, it's holding a lot of threads together to do that. And you weave it together, I think, beautifully. So I really recommend people check it out because there's a lot to think about there, and you bring it forward in a way that I think is it's very thought provoking and enriching and poetic.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I think you should trademark or in some way protect that idea of bioregional intersectionality. That's just brilliant stuff. But I appreciate the your appreciation and look forward to being in conversation not only with you but any folks who choose to spend their time reading this book. What a gift that is to share that part of your lives with this thing that I've been mulling over and sweating over for quite a while. So yeah, I just have so much gratitude for folks who engage this stuff or are doing this work, regardless of whether or not they read my book, that's unimportant in the larger perspective of the work that many folks get up to. And yeah, just so much gratitude to share.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful note to end on, and important for everybody to find time for reflecting on what they're grateful for, because there's always people doing good work to make the world a better place, and to acknowledge that gratitude really helps us deal with the despair and the negativity of our situation. So yeah, I appreciate that thought, and I'll work on trademarking the bioregional intersectionality.
You should, and I if anyone is a grateful person or a thankful person, I feel like I'm the last and the least. It's not my MO. So I don't want to appear in this podcast as though that I'm saintly or doing that on a regular basis. I try, but so I'm reminding myself as much as I'm reminding anyone of the gratitude that I feel for this work and the folks like Catherine Keller and Laurel Kearns and so many others who have been so faithfully fighting and resisting in ways that I don't know that I ever could. So my gratitude is for the shoulders that I stand on, I think more than anything else.
Nice. Very well said. Yeah, likewise for me. I'm not an expert on gratitude either. I'm good at telling other people to, hey, don't forget about gratitude. And then myself, I'm like, no, I don't really do it as much as I should. So it's nice to be a little humble about it.
Mm-hmm.
Geez, this was great. We'll have to do it again sometime. I think we still have a lot more to talk about, and wanted to say some more things that will upset the Delusians and Duridians out there, and so more work to do. But it was a treat. O'Neill Van Horn, thank you so much for this lovely conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, such a pleasure. And thanks to everybody for listening or watching. We'll be back with some more conversations for you soon. In the meantime, take care and be well.